Way to go, Lucy. Right as I'm about to hit record, of course you got to go ahead and do that. Now, to start off with, I'm going to warn everybody that I am about to make some very bold claims. You may disagree with these. However, if you can disprove them, absolutely feel free to do so. I welcome the idea of being challenged in these. However, it should be, for the most part, and just a blanket over the entire thing, essentially explaining how things are going to work. So, to start off with, we're going to go ahead and say that there's no time travel in the MCU to begin with. Doctor Strange did not kill Iron Man. I was always mad about that. Actually, it was the TVA, because that would make the most sense here. And the sacred timeline is entirely linear. There were multiple universes the entire time. And we're going to go ahead and get into explaining that right now. So to preface this real quick, we're just going to go ahead and say that this is my own personal theory. It's something that I've been working on for quite a little bit of time, ever since Endgame happened. And Bruce Banner went ahead and started explaining about the fact that time travel doesn't work. You can't interact with your past self because it'll affect your present self and stuff like that. If I'm talking really fast, just because I want to get all of the information out like pretty quickly, I want to be kind of concise here and get this all out. If you guys have any concerns about anything that I'm saying, feel free to write questions, everything down there. So this started all today. Around 4 or 5 hours ago, I went ahead and I made a post on Facebook, and people went nuts over it. This is by far the most interaction I've gotten on a post in like 5 hours. I've got 151 reply or 52 replies. There's still new comments being added to it currently, and I'm getting tons of reacts. And a lot of people are taking it kind of negatively, and a lot of people are just not quite all there on the explanation. Some people glanced through it, some people read through it. I've got like all of the different stuff that I was explaining about, like to different people, because I made a post about it making claims. Started explaining them. Some people read them, some people didn't. A lot of people got offended. It's really interesting the way that a lot of people ended up reacting to that. Regardless, we're going to get into some of the concerns that they had and how I have answers for them and different things. So essentially the way that I'm working off of this is the idea that multiverses were in existence the entire time, and that Kang, or people who what they assumed to be Kang, he didn't explicitly say it, he just said I'm the Conqueror during it. The assumption is that it's Kang. We're going to work with that as the name. However, we're not going to go off of the assumption from anything that he's done in the comics. We're just going to be working off the Marvel Cinematic Universe, mainly for Infinity War, Endgame, and Loki. So all 6 episodes and both movies. Now, a lot of this doesn't happen in Infinity War. However, there's a little bit of interaction with Doctor Strange and the hashtag Doctor Strange killed Iron Man, which personally I was really miffed about when they first introduced it. However, it's been explained a little bit more now, and I'll be explaining that here as well and how it fits into the entire theory that I have cooked up. Now, to start off with, we're going to be talking about the fact that in the final episode, spoilers by the way for all of them, in the final episode, he who remains, we'll just call him Kang, just because it's a lot easier to say Kang than he who remains. In the very last episode, he ends up explaining about the fact that the sacred timeline is more of a loop, and we see it looping around the entirety of the structure in the castle that they're in. However, the effective way that it ends up working out is a little bit more linear in just a start point and an end point. So when a universe starts, and then as far as Kang could see, because that is as far as we're able to see, and that is where the timelines end up diverging. The problem with this hypothesis of the idea that it is a singular timeline and it is just being pruned off here and there as stuff happens is the fact that all of that stuff has already happened as far as he is concerned. The idea that they wouldn't previously know about the fact that the pruning is going to need to be happening constantly is problematic. He does have it programmed specifically like that, and we know that he ends up specifically manipulating the system to serve his own needs, because he does have a Nexus event that happens right when Lamentus is about to be destroyed and Loki's about to be killed. So we know that he is specifically trying to make it so that way Loki and Sylvie end up being brought to him, and the reason that he knows what they are going to say is not because of the fact that he can see the future, it's because he's already had these conversations with them, and the reason that he ends up deciding to change it is because he's already had the conversation, and he just goes ahead and gives up and decides he's going to stop using the TVA and keeping the timeline safe. The reason that you see it splitting off rather than towards the end of time, because if we're assuming that the time motion here is linear and that this is as far into time it happens, once he gives up, it should no longer branch off in the lower portions. It wouldn't make sense if it's just one continuous timeline. We're only watching a single version of the universe play out, because the only people that would be left at that point would be all of the Lokis and the cannibals and whoever else happens to be lucky enough, Frog Thor, creating the variations from there, and it wouldn't make sense for the entire looping timeline to then go off in different portions. However, for the analysis of Loki itself, we're going to assume that this is one timeline going throughout the entire thing, starting with the divergence back during the 2012, Loki gets captured in New York, and then moving on through Endgame. So when Endgame initially happened, we're going to start off there. Professor Hulk, Bruce Banner, ends up explaining the fact that you can't interact with yourself in a previous version, which immediately enacts the idea of the fact that they are actually transferring themselves into a different version of the multiverse. I'm still getting comments on it, right? Literally since I started recording, there's like 11 new comments. Anyway, the idea is that you can't interact, so it has to be jumping to a different multiverse. You're affecting their timeline, their future changes, and it diverts from your own. You can't ever go back to your own timeline and expect to be in that version. That assumes that time is moving linear for the both of the universes, not necessarily parallel universes, but close enough that you won't be able to tell the difference, because in the infinite universe theory, there are infinite versions of your universe that are completely different. That also has to mean that there are infinite universes of your universe that's exactly the same. So you could jump to infinite universes and think that you're jumping through time. You wouldn't know the difference. That is also the way that it ends up happening as far as Loki goes in Endgame, when you're trying to explain the fact that it is one continuous line simply being pruned, as we see kind of happening in the Loki show. However, reading the subtext, you get a little bit more out of that. So, to explain what they are doing in Endgame, he says specifically you can't time travel. And then they brush it over and they go ahead and they say that they're time traveling anyway. In reality, what it seems to be happening more is that if they are traveling to their own timeline, if we're making that assumption, they would be transferring back to when they went and got the Tesseract. That would mean that the divergent Loki that we have becomes the variant. They prune off that reality, and stuff continues normally. So the Tesseract doesn't actually end up in Loki's hands somewhere else. He just ends up going off on his own thing, and then the timeline continues like normal. This also assumes that Kang had specifically planned for the snap to happen, the anti-snap to happen, because the TVA specifically says they don't care about the Avengers going back in time and grabbing all of this stuff. They just care about the fact that Loki wasn't supposed to have the Tesseract and wasn't supposed to be able to escape. So they go ahead and they prune that, and then they let time continue happening as it would normally up until the points of Endgame, and then the hint in the end of WandaVision, which we're not going to get into, about the fact that the multiverse might be happening right at the end credits. Moving on with the idea of the fact that it is one continuous timeline, there are just a few more issues that end up happening with this. Mainly the fact that if it is a continuous timeline and it is only one universe, the idea that it suddenly starts splitting off in the past time doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But then we also come to the major problem of the fact that when Sylvie ends up going to the superstore, she ends up getting the gum and leaving it behind in one of the first episodes, and then they end up going there and discovering her. The problem with this is that they explain it off as the fact that you can hide in apocalypses because your presence there will not affect the outcome of it. So, hence the explanation of this when they're testing it out. Loki goes back to Pompeii, screams everybody is going to die there, creates a huge hullabaloo. It all gets destroyed. Nobody remembers that it happened. Doesn't matter that they were there to begin with. No fragments in the timeline are created, no Nexus events. So they realize that any apocalyptic event where nobody in that situation is able to escape and affect something else from the outside world means that you can hide there, which is the exact same that we see reiterated when you see old Loki. He says he faked his own death and he ran away. With my theory, that also means that the Loki that we saw die in Endgame might not actually be dead. Get into that a little bit later. But because of this, that means that when you go to a particular area, it self-prunes. So if you happen to go there and you were to start to create a branch, that branch cannot actually continue anywhere. The problem with that is that once you go to a branch, because no actual pruning is taking place, that is still in the proper timeline, which means that if you were time traveling, jumping back to Lamentis, or as we see, the Superstore where she's hiding out, if you were to jump back to that particular time frame, say you jump back 5 minutes before it all blows up, or whatever else ends up happening in any particular apocalypse, you head there 5 minutes before it happens, you can't stay there for very long. Yeah, you could keep going back, but then we run into the problem that we already have of the paradox of the fact that she was there, continued to do her work taking down the TVA, traveled back to the exact same place and time, supposedly, where no pruning has happened, and there aren't multiple Sylvies there, which defies logic. So if she's been hiding out in apocalypses, she would have to find a different apocalypse every single time, which you could argue ends up happening. However, we see this not to be true in the fact that she ends up leaving the bubblegum from that superstore in one of her places, continues on to go do other stuff, and then comes back to the superstore again, meaning that you should... Lucy! Meaning that you should be able to actually witness multiple Sylvies in the same place at the same time. Because this doesn't happen, the only explanation that we have is that you actually end up transferring to a different universe.
Food is done.
Yeah, I'm busy. I'm busy.
It's already...
I'm aware. I'm busy. He literally came in and said that like right before I started recording anyway. So moving on from there, you have the... Sorry, let me regather my thoughts. So with the fact that we don't end up seeing multiple Sylvies, the only explanation is that she's actually jumping to parallel universes that take place at slightly different time frames. Because Sylvie was never there to begin with, every time she goes back, she's at a different version of that. So she's actually just jumping between the different universes that all fall within the sacred timeline that isn't one universe, it is multiple different universes at different stages in time, different... areas of development. So one is 2012 at the same time that our MCU is happening. One is in 1950, one is way back, one is way forward. They're all happening on different time frames. They just all end up being condensed down into following the strict sacred timeline. So the way of imagining this is that every single timeline is individually being handcrafted into what Kang defines as what he should be like a perfect pot. So he's just got all of them going at the exact same time. Should an imperfection pop up, that's when the TVA steps in and they go and they correct it so that way it continues along the regular path of history. So that means that at any given time, they're monitoring all of these different universes and they don't understand that what they're doing is jumping between universes. They just see it as time travel, but time travel doesn't actually happen, and Mobius explains this. He specifically says that when a Nexus event happens, they can only react to it in real time, even though they say that the TVA doesn't follow the confirmation of time. Normally, it does. Time passes in the TVA just like everywhere else does. That's why they have to react in a linear fashion along a regular time frame to all of the Nexus events that are happening. That's the explanation that they have for why they can't go back and they can't prune Sylvie before she managed to escape, is because she did escape. They might have pruned that timeline, but she got away. And they can't go back again because time travel doesn't actually exist. What they're doing is they're jumping between the different universes at different stages in the development, and that's why it has that. Also, this explains about the fact that you can have a black Loki, you can have a younger Loki, and all of the other ones existing at the exact same time. Because they are all the same age in the end time, at the end of time, they're all the same age. It doesn't matter if one is one particular race or species or anything. It just matters that to Kang, he doesn't end up creating more versions of himself that end up creating the multi-universal wars. So the main goal that he has is to just keep all universes as they are created and come under his watch. They follow a strict timeline all the way through to their end to prevent any kind of divergence from it. And while Miss Minutes in the very beginning, she ends up explaining that this is the sort of thing that, like, if you're late to work or something like that, this creates a massive divergence in the timeline. Yeah, sometimes small stuff like that might end up happening due to a butterfly effect, but for most cases, that's why they end up with Lokis, is because Lokis are a much larger scale, more into free will, more into trickery and stuff like that. That's why they end up encountering so many of them. So the idea that you tripped and broke your nose and you weren't supposed to have tripped on your aglet or whatever while you were walking down the street, that's a little bit out of place. In the whole hypothetical situations that she ends up coming up with. So the way that is explained is not that great. It's more of the higher tier heavy hitters that end up causing actual Nexus events. Moving on here, I have some more notes. When you try to view it as a single timeline, it doesn't work just because of the ending with Sylvie in the Superstore, and then with the fact that after it ends, stuff continues splitting off. So what ends up happening is that after he says he doesn't know anything that happens from there on, that is him deciding that he is done with actually maintaining all of the different universes. Upon him deciding he's not maintaining them, now they can have Nexus events that just happen and branch off into all sorts of different things. I can explain a visualization of how this all ends up taking place here just a little bit. We'll get to that. For the most part, I kind of explained a lot of this. No time travel. So, as this pertains particularly to Doctor Strange, when it happened in Infinity War where he simply just gave up the stone as far as we could see, I don't believe what happened is that they couldn't defeat Thanos, because everybody who has a brainstem would just know that you would just not include Peter Quill, and you would come up with a different strategy for getting the gauntlet off of him that doesn't require him to specifically be available and say, why have you done this? The reason that he ends up going through 14 million different variations is because if the snap was meant to happen and they ended up defeating him and taking the gauntlet from him at that point, that would be a Nexus event and the TVA would immediately show up. So imagine the beginning to Doctor Strange's movie that will be coming out later, explaining that a little bit. I would love it if they actually did bother going through with that, because the TVA would be a perfect excuse for why they weren't able to defeat him, because every time they would defeat him, the TVA would show up, Doctor Strange has to deal with it. I imagine that at some point he would have ended up going with them and being able to see an alternate universe that ended up, he gave up the stone, saw what happened, saw that it was the minimal amount of lives that needed to be given, Iron Man's, and still following within the TVA guidelines, and then coming back and actually doing it in ours and actually using the time stone. Now, the time stone is not necessarily time travel. If you wanted to, you could see it more as just being able to see forward in time, because it's the only person, it's only one person that's able to manipulate anything at a time. In addition to this, back when you have the endgame actually happening and they go back and they get the stones, they end up leaving behind Nebula, and then an alternate Thanos ends up going and grabbing that. And there is an explanation of this without requiring an actual version of a different universe being required. So if you were to assume the main timeline, that would mean that the younger Thanos ended up discovering Nebula, leaving his area, creating a different branch, which would then be pruned. He would then move forward in time to where the events actually take place, and then they would be able to have their fight there, as the TVA would probably dictate, or even not dictate, if you were to assume that the TVA ends up being destroyed somewhere around this time, and then anything after Endgame no longer being affected by it. So the idea of an extra version of Gamora being back in, the TVA wouldn't be able to react to that because they're gone. Since the idea of Loki is that the Avengers, in their time frame, if we're using an alternate universe theory, if they are in 20, when did it come out? 2020? 20, yeah, 2020, right? 2019? 20? Endgame. When Endgame happened, and then going back the 8-ish years to the other one, if they happened at the same time in the same universe, along the same time frame that they are currently having, and then that is actually where a linear to the end of time happens, right at that end game, then this 2012 version of Loki and that reality would continue branching off on its own after that no longer happened, or the the TVA is no longer monitoring it, and then is no longer monitoring it at Endgame. So both of the different versions that we've seen, the one that Loki is from and the one that we see in the MCU and we've been following for the most part, after Endgame, you would then have the branching into the Multiverse of Madness. Branches happen all different times. Yeah, we covered that. So when the timeline splits, it goes from all different timelines and stuff like that, which then supports the idea of the multiple different universes actually being monitored and not actually being explained properly. I do have some more conversations that ended up happening between the characters to explain it a little bit more. Things that seem almost a little bit more like the throwaway lines, like Mobius explaining that they have to react to stuff in a linear time fashion, even though they had lied and said that they operated outside of a time frame. Again, back when they had tried to yada yada the time travel stuff, and Loki had originally picked up the Tesseract before they introduced the idea of the TVA to the MCU, the idea that he would be able to pick that up and it wouldn't automatically change the future was absolutely ridiculous. They ended up explaining that with the TVA. However, even back then, it made more sense for it to have been a separate dimension that they were jumping to rather than just the separate timeline, because you can have separate timeline variations and different universes happening at the same time, which is the easiest way of explaining the way that Loki is set up, is that all the different universes are being monitored at the same time by one in their own respective time frames. So we're moving to the supermarket. Yep, can't have that. Yep. I think I've actually pretty much explained the entire thing. So essentially the way to best imagine this is that if there is no time travel in the MCU, but you still want all of this to still be explained, the best way of doing that is to imagine you are watching a YouTube video, and in the video, or in the TV series, they explain it as a specific line, and then it goes off and it diverges into its different pathways. So if you were watching a YouTube video and you hit start and you had one line, and then it slowly branched off, and then it just kept branching off into all the different directions, that is a single timeline being broken into multiple different different timelines, and then essentially functioning like their own separate versions of these particular universes. However, you won't get the massive variations that you have of the like the alligator Loki or something like that. You could if it happened all the way very back at the beginning of time, but it's a lot less likely for something like that to have happened. That would happen a lot more with the parallel universes and then being able to stack on top of each other. So if you imagine one version, so imagine the MCU that we see it now as that one timeline, and then because of that timeline being broken at the end of Loki, then having all of the different versions, that is one particular way of how they end up seeing it. However, if you also use the infinite universe theory, so we have the idea of the multiverse of just what they had gone off of and then their own branches, but then in addition to that having other ones, because time is always going to continue in the same direction. You can't branch off into different timelines and then end up jumping back to previously in time. However, if you have all of these different universes that are taking place at different portions of time, then in addition to that, imagine that that one YouTube video that you have is just a sheet of paper inside a book, and all of those pages happen to start at different timestamps in the video. So as you scrub back and forth through the video, you're not actually traveling through time, you're just viewing it at different portions, and then say one is a massive spider web and then one is just barely starting off. You can still, with the infinite universe theory, move between the two of them. So if you imagine them all stacked on top of each other, like pages in a book, and then being able to connect little dots in the spider web to each other through it, and just keep going in and out infinitely, you would essentially just have a cube that all the way back at the very beginning just looks like a flat sheet of paper this way, and then as you scrub through, you would just see all of these tendrils moving out and becoming all of this massive cube that continues on through all of time and would just continuously get more and more dense. And that is all of the different universes stacked up on top of each other, all interacting with themselves and then interacting with the other universes as well. So that is the idea essentially of being able to time travel without actually needing to break the laws of physics, because if you were to, well, you'd be breaking the laws of physics no matter what. We're going to ignore that. But it makes a whole lot more sense than the idea of actually being able to create a paradox or a time-space continuum problem, is that you are always just going to a separate universe, and you're never actually affecting your own universe. And you can go back to your own, but the problem there is that you would just be going into any other universe. If there's infinite universes, there's no guarantee you're ever going to a specific one or back to your own in particular. You might end up just coming back to an identical one, but you've never actually seen any of the people there before. So that's essentially the way that it ends up boiling down. I did have somebody ask a question that I found was really interesting. They asked, can our Loki actually be alive, based off of this theory as well? And the Loki that they were referring to was the MCU version of Loki, the one that got choked to death in Endgame. And the answer is yes, actually. If he did the exact same thing that old Loki did, where he created a version of himself that ended up getting killed, and then he bided his time until the TVA, which of course, with the assumption of the linear timeline, is that once they stop functioning, wherever our MCU is at is where the Multiverse of Madness would be able to begin, and then it would still branch off to the other timelines because they're alternate universes. If he was just not doing anything to create a Nexus event until the TVA stopped, he could come back and do whatever he wanted while still being the exact same Loki we had before. However, the question then is that which Loki would we rather be with? Is it the one from the show that's in love with Sylvie, or is it the one that ended up sacrificing himself? Honestly, I wouldn't mind some both, but that's a lot of stuff that just can't be answered until we end up knowing where they want to go with it. However, this is essentially the way of explaining that everything could possibly happen. I'm going to take a quick scrub here through all of the different stuff. Got replies to the actual post itself. I'm just going through here, looking through real quick. I don't see anything that I haven't said yet. There were a few smaller things that some people had some concerns about, but they ended up being easily explained through something that I already said. There was a lot of people that were like, it doesn't make sense because they said they were time traveling, and the explanation there is that they barely understood what they were doing in Endgame when they were time traveling to begin with. The fact that they were able to even pinpoint where and when they wanted to go was amazing. But again, you can just have the explanation of the fact that they were jumping to a different universe, and that solves all problems. They already said that the time moves linearly, and despite what some people within the universe, the characters themselves, who can have faults and can be ignorant of information, they say that it works that way, but nobody actually has all of the answers as of yet. Nobody's come forward in universe and explained the way that all of this ends up working out. It just happens to be that, assuming that all universes existed at all times and only began branching in the particular cluster that the MCU is currently being seen through for us as the viewers particularly, is just now going to begin diverging. Although the universes already existed, they were just a lot more well monitored. And I think that's just about it. So that's kind of all I have left here. I actually got it done quite a bit faster than I originally planned because, again, I was arguing for several hours with people on here. And if anybody wants to go ahead and share this video to any friends, family, people that you know that are interested and have some concerns. If you personally have some concerns, absolutely feel free to leave it for me, and I will pin it and then have a response for you because, again, like I said, this pretty much sums up about everything, any concerns that could possibly happen. And the main reason that I ended up coming up with the explanation for it is because I actually have my own book series. I've only got the first one published right now, but that's essentially the way that I had it all figured out as well, was that time travel, I didn't want it, didn't make sense. The paradoxes involved every single time anybody tries to do any time travel made absolutely no sense. It only made sense to have multiple universes. And so that was kind of where I was going a little bit with it, but that's not actually where my first book is. So if anybody's interested in my first book, I will leave a link in the description, but I'll go ahead and give a quick description of it here now. So if you were just here for the Marvel stuff, absolutely feel free to go. I won't bother you anymore, but if you guys happen to be interested in reading fantasy books, I have a 200-page introductory novel to my fantasy series that I started. It features a young female named Lauren. She happens to be a lesbian pit fighter. That's not all that's in the book, but that's the best way that I have describing it very shortly. Feel free to check it out. If you guys have any questions about it, I can go ahead and answer them in the comments as well. And hope everybody has an awesome time. And if this theory could get some more traction and end up being disproven or proven at some point in the future, that would be awesome, considering that I've had the theory since Endgame happened, and it's only just now coming to more light because Loki has added a lot more questions that a lot of people weren't really interested in answering too much. And even upon trying to explain some of the stuff that they didn't directly state happened in here, I had a lot of people that gave me a lot of negative feedback and told me that I was stupid and that I needed to pay more attention and stuff like that, because they were taking everything that was said to them at face value while at the same time not understanding that the characters were also specifically said that they were lying. So the idea that any of the information that the TVA was giving out was to be given as gospel was very strange. Anyway, thank you everybody very much for your time, and that's all I have.